Most of what we consider knowledge, the knowledge that guides us every day through our lives, we take on faith. But this is knowledge that's been distilled, organized, and presented to us by sources that we have decided to trust. Only rarely do we go to scientific sources, the original sources or scientific papers. And when I say we, I'm including scientists, to really make an effort to test the validity of the information we've been told. We simply don't have the time or the skills to do that. And when politicized, we tend to believe the information that's presented to us by our representatives, the people we have decided to trust. And we tend to consume that information with little and sometimes no scrutiny. So this next panel is going to consider how we balance misinformation, censorship, and academic freedom. And it will be moderated by George Tidmarsh. Dr. Tidmarsh is, works in biotechnology and pharmaceutical development in and outside of academia. He's also adjunct professor of pediatrics and neonatology at the Stanford Medical School. He's known for shepherding drugs, new drugs, through the FDA process and patients through a complex medical system. Thank you, Dr. Tidmarsh.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody, for being here today. And, of course, Jay, for organizing this. I had a special pleasure over the last year and a half to get to know and work with Jay. And I can truly say he's a friend and colleague. So thanks again. And Jay said to me, he said, you know, I'm giving you actually the hardest job. And I'm not sure that's the case. Maybe, we'll see. If anything gets thrown at me up here, but I actually feel most honored because the debate that should occur around scientific and medical ideas is essentially the essence of the scientific process. And in my mind, you know, we'd still believe that all celestial bodies revolve around the earth if we didn't actually discuss and debate fringe ideas. And of course, I use that word a little bit in jest. So, you know, one anecdote, of course, you might know about the 2005 prize Nobel Prize in Medicine. That was won in a very hard way by Barry Marshall. No one believed that his theory that H. pylori caused peptic ulcer disease. In fact, he was vilified in the scientific community. He was outcast, he lost funding, he was down and out. And what he did was quite remarkable. He actually grew up a culture of H. pylori, gave it to himself, endoscopically, before and after, proved that he got peptic ulcer disease, recovered the organism, and fulfilled Koch's postulates, and won the Nobel Prize. Okay, so he went from being vilified and outcast to the Nobel Prize, and that's persistence. And the problem is that we have a tendency to vilify incredibly important ideas that are fringe. And so this panel is going to look at that concept in which you have to balance that fundamental scientific principle of engaging the most wide-ranging ideas, yet at the same time, that clashing with a tenet of health policy, which is once you've made a decision and once you implement something, you have to be rigorous and you have to be absolute about it. And sometimes debate is squashed. So I'm very honored to moderate this panel, and we'll let each introduce themselves, but briefly, Scott Atlas is the Robert Wesson Senior Fellow of Health Policy here at the Hoover Institution. Alex Berenson, journalist and author, along with Gardiner Harris, journalist and author. Neil Malhotra is the Edith M. Cornell Professor of Political Economy at Stanford Graduate School of Business. Michael McConnell is a Richard and Frances Mallory Professor of Law, Director of the Constitutional Law Center here at Stanford, Hoover Senior Fellow, and also co-chair of Meta's outside oversight board, which issued a report on COVID policies, and I think he'll talk a little bit about that. And then Janine Younes, who's the litigation counsel at the New Civil Liberties Alliance. So I'll ask each of our panelists to give a 5-minute introduction, their thoughts, and then we'll go into questions, and I really want to facilitate crosstalk and conversation amongst our panelists. So, Scott, please take it away.
Thanks, George. To speak about censorship, we first must acknowledge the factual context. Lockdowns were instituted. They failed to stop the dying. They failed to stop the spread. That's the data. Bjornskov, 2021, Ben David, 2021, Agarwal, 2021, Herbie, 2022, Kirpin, 2023, Ioannidis, 2024. And yes, lockdowns also inflicted massive damage on children and literally killed people. Bianchi, over the next 15 to 20 years, the unemployment alone will cause 900,000 to 1.2 million extra American deaths from the economic lockdown, not the virus. Ioannidis, the U.S. would have had 1.6 million fewer deaths if it had the performance of Sweden. All judgment of the U.S. response lies at the hands of the lockdowners. Birx, who wrote the official federal Trump policy to every governor before, during, and after my 3.5 months in Washington. Fauci, Redfield, the CDC, the university experts, including at Stanford, who convinced officials to implement their lockdowns. Unfortunately, my advice, targeted protection, was rejected, with rare exceptions like Florida. Targeted protection, increasing the protection of the high risk, ending the lockdowns and school closures that were destroying the poor and our children, advised since March 2020, repeatedly for months, and then formally codified in October 2020 by J. Martin and Sinatra in their Great Barrington Declaration. Remember, lockdowns were not caused by the virus. Human beings decided to do lockdowns. They own the results. Their lockdowns were implemented. Those policies killed and destroyed millions. That's fact. That's the data. This was a health policy problem. Virology is not health policy. Epidemiology is not health policy. Those are only pieces of a larger, more complicated puzzle. The stunning fact, I was the only health policy scholar on the White House task force, the only one focused on stopping both the death and destruction from the virus and the death and destruction from the policy itself. That's health policy. That's my field. As Hannah Arendt observed in Eichmann in Jerusalem, what has come to light is neither nihilism nor cynicism, as one might have expected, but a quite extraordinary confusion over elementary questions of morality. Censorship was first done by the media companies themselves when it counted most in 2020, before the Biden administration, when school closures and lockdowns were being implemented. May 2020, YouTube bragged, quote, its aggressive policies against misinformation. August 2020, Facebook admitted it had already taken down 7 million posts on the pandemic. My interviews as advisor to the president were pulled down. YouTube, September 2020, Twitter, October 2020. You might think the public in a free society should know what the advisor to the president was saying. What was the response to truth at Stanford and other universities? Censorship, character assassination, intimidation, and censure. It was also nuanced, being told, quote, stop writing X, quote, write an apology for X. Colleagues told, quote, stop defending Scott. No more speaking at institutional events. And understand clearly, when you censor health policy, it's not simply an abstract evil, a less than ideal environment for diverse views. People die, and people died from the censorship of correct health policy. Why censorship? To shut someone up, yes, but more importantly, to deceive the public, to stop others from hearing, to convince a naive public there's a consensus. But truth is not a team sport. Truth is not determined by consensus or by numbers of people who agree or by titles. It's discovered by debate, proven by critical analysis of evidence. Arguments are won by data, by logic, not by personal attack or censoring. That's why the lockdowners at Stanford and elsewhere needed censorship. They couldn't win on the data. They needed to delegitimize, to demonize opposing views as highly dangerous, to convince the public, especially their lie that if you're against lockdowns, you're for letting it rip. I never advised let it rip. It was never even mentioned in the White House, and that is not targeted protection. We now have a frightening crisis of both competence and integrity. The lockdowners will never admit they were wrong, and I and others here were right. That would take integrity, but truth cannot be changed. Churchill got it right. Truth is incontrovertible. Resent it, deride it, distort it, but there it is. And truth means the earth is round. Masks do not stop the spread of a viral respiratory infection. Lockdowns killed and destroyed millions, especially sinfully the poor. Now those same people run from accountability using a perversion of logic rivaling Kafka. They want to blame those of us who disagreed with what was done for the failure of what was done. As a professor and physician at top universities for 30 years, as a graduate of the University of Chicago School of Medicine when facts mattered, I fear for our students. They can't learn critical thinking without hearing different views. Yet many faculty members of our acclaimed universities are dangerously intolerant of contrary opinions. Some employ toxic smears and organize rebukes against those of us who disagreed, and worse, who dared to help the country, their country, under a president they happen to despise. I'm proud to be an outlier, happily proven right when the inliers are so wrong. But cancel culture stops others from speaking and risks that future experts with a reputation to lose will be unwilling to serve their country in contentious times. Being proven right is not sufficient. A peaceful society is built on trust. That won't continue if it's filled by people who lack the moral compass to admit their errors and who refuse to allow views counter to their own. We all need the courage to act with certainty on Arendt's elementary questions of morality. Finally, to the students, never forget what G.K. Chesterton said. Right is right, even if nobody does it. Wrong is wrong, even if everybody's wrong about it. Thank you.
Thanks, Scott. Perhaps as the panel goes on, we can get you to tell us what you really think. Alex.
About 6 years ago, in January 2019, I wrote a book called Tell Your Children, which was about cannabis and its psychiatric harms, and it was sort of widely disliked and panned. My old employers, the New York Times, didn't cover it. I don't know if you saw the New York Times this morning or their website. They had a very long article about the health harms of high-potency cannabis, specifically the psychiatric harms. So sometimes you're not wrong, sometimes you're just ahead, and right or wrong, you have the right to speak. I have the right to speak. I have the right to speak on social media platforms and anywhere else that I can as an American. The First Amendment says that the government cannot take action against me or you for trying to exercise that right. In California, actually your rights are even a little bit bigger than that. Outside of social media platforms, you have a limited right to speak on large private property, thanks to a decision called Pruneyard about 30 years ago. That doesn't apply to every state, but it does actually apply to California. My rights were violated. The federal government violated my rights. It conspired with Pfizer, unbelievably but true, to violate my rights and to force Twitter to ban me. That happened in 2021. I was very fortunate in that I had some assurances from an executive at Twitter that enabled me to go to court in 2022 and win my way back onto the platform. I think I'm the only person ever to be reinstated by a social media company following a lawsuit over a ban. Elon Musk did not put me back on Twitter. Twitter put me back on Twitter before he took over. Probably almost none of you know any of this because essentially the mainstream media will not report on the facts of my case or what happened to me because it's so embarrassing. But all of that did happen. There are court documents showing it. You can go up to the Northern District of California and look at them, or you can just look at them online. So I'm now suing the federal government as well as Scott Gottlieb, the former FDA commissioner, now board member at Pfizer. Yes, the former FDA commissioner is now a board member at Pfizer, as well as a guy named Andy Slavitt, who both when he was at the White House and shortly after he left, successfully campaigned to get Twitter to ban me. It's very clear from the documents that I have gotten already, as well as documents that the House Judiciary Committee got over the last couple of years, that senior people at both Twitter and Facebook did not appreciate the pressure that the federal government was putting them under, wanted to protect Americans' rights to free speech. Amazingly, Mark Zuckerberg and Cheryl and a guy named Nick Clegg, who wasn't even American, he's the British Prime Minister at Facebook, all stood up to the federal government as it tried to censor, and then decided that they had bigger interests at stake because the federal government is so powerful that trying to stand up to the White House is a very difficult thing to do, even when you're Facebook, much less when you're Twitter, which was much smaller. So the federal government wanted me silenced because I was raising questions about the mRNAs. it wanted me silenced specifically because those questions were real and evidence-based rather than the usual nanoparticle nonsense, which they, and unfortunately probably some people in this room, think are the main complaints that people who are skeptical about the mRNAs have. My questions about the mRNAs have nothing to do with nanoparticles and everything to do with the study design in 2020 for the large clinical trials that led to their authorization and then approval, as well as a lot of data that has come out since, which I promised Jay I wouldn't get into. I'm not going to get into, but I'm glad to talk about it another time.
30 seconds.
I got 30 seconds left. I will just say this. There was another great censorship scheme in 2020 and 2021, and it involved the lab leak. And we now know that the people who thought that the lab leak was the most likely, if not the absolute, let's say 99% origin of COVID were correct. Science is hard, but letting people tell the truth is easy. It's what we should do in the United States and everywhere else, but as an American, I particularly care about the United States. Thank you.
Thank you. And of course, we'll cover the lab leak versus Zoonotic this afternoon. Gardiner.
Alex and I were on the drug beat together at the New York Times for how many years?
4 or 5?
4 or 5, yeah. He then became an incredibly successful novelist to my great envy, and I soldiered on in the bowels of journalism, eventually becoming a White House correspondent, a diplomatic correspondent for the New York Times. I just want to roll back a little bit in my career. I was a cop reporter in Louisville, Kentucky for a while. I investigated a corrupt police chief. The department put me under constant surveillance from their black bag unit, which was called the intelligence unit. One of the cops' wives tried to entrap me into committing a crime so they could then arrest me. Another cop pulled a gun on me to get me to stop asking questions. My editors moved me to Hazard, Kentucky to get me away from the Louisville cops, where I lived for 4 years. While in Hazard, the movie company that shot Steven Seagal's Fire Down Below movie, which took place in Hazard, tried to get a restraining order against me so that I couldn't show up at the filming places. Also, while I was there, I accused the sitting governor of committing felonies. He then had a large political rally, which I, of course, had to cover. From the podium, he pointed down at me, denounced me personally, and I didn't think I would actually get out of there alive. I then went to the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times. I was sent to India. While I was in India, I did a tough story. The US Embassy kicked me out of the American Club, which meant that my kids could no longer play Little League, soccer, all those great American sports. We couldn't use the pool. My kids were disinvited from birthday parties by, again, US government employees. When I came back to the United States to be a White House correspondent, I was repeatedly, people in both administrations, the Obama administration, we actually did a story about this, put me at the top of their enemies lists and started surveilling my sources. The Trump administration repeatedly asked my bosses to fire me. Judy Miller, one of our colleagues, was actually put in jail for some time. During the Trump administration, 3 of my colleagues had their phone records subpoenaed. I'm sorry about Alex, but Alex was not subpoenaed. There was no FBI agents after him. He was never put in jail. I mean, I'm thrilled that my friends on the right are finally concerned about the First Amendment and about protecting journalists. I've been here for a long time, and I've had my life threatened countless times. And in fact, Donald Trump made clear that he believes that reporters are the enemy of the people. He has promised to use the police powers of the executive to go after his enemies. Are we going to be okay if he starts arresting reporters? The Supreme Court just made it okay, I think, for him to call a hit on a reporter as long as he's deemed as part of his official functions. I think he has immunity for that. So, again, I am thrilled that we are now concerned on both the left and the right of First Amendment rights and about the freedom of reporters to do their jobs. My only question to those on the right is, where the hell have you been for all these years?
Great. Thank you.
Hi, thanks. So I'm not a medical researcher, I'm a social scientist, so that's the perspective of my comments. I do research on things like algorithms, misinformation, social media platforms. I have a lot of research collaborators on these platforms. So I'll have 3 quick points. So one, what is kind of the current state of this censorship and misinformation? So after the 2016 election, the platforms were very aggressive. But they've ratcheted back a lot of that aggression. Part of it is that they've fired tons of people who worked on this stuff in these companies themselves. When it comes to pressure from the federal government, my sense is that I think they will be more resistant going forward. And part of that reason is that I think they're going to be regulated anyway on things like antitrust and other things. And they kind of know that both the Democratic and Republican Party hate them a lot. So I think they're a bit less kind of worried of nice platform you have, the shame if anything happened to it. And I think there's a lot of interesting new innovations occurring that researchers are studying, like the X community notes function. So ways that we can kind of democratically on these platforms assess misinformation. And the X technology is very interesting because what the algorithm does is it flags something as a community note if both liberals and conservatives on the platform flag it. So they have machine learning algorithms that tag their users as liberal and conservative, and they say if there's diverse people who raise concerns with a piece of information, then it gets flagged. Not censored, but flagged. So that's kind of the current state. Second, I think kind of one reason we got into this mess is because there was a conflation in the public health community between facts and values. And one reason is I think a lot of these people are not well trained in the liberal arts, so they conflate facts and values. So facts are things that it doesn't depend on other people believing them for them to be true and have power. So gravity is a fact. It doesn't matter if any of us believe or not believe in gravity, it's going to have an effect. But then there's other things like values, like human rights, democracy, et cetera, that only are true things if other people, other human beings believe in them. So how did this cause problems during COVID? So what we relied on public health officials to do was give us facts. What is the R0 value? What are the symptoms of COVID? What is the prognosis if you get it? That's what people needed to know. But the problem is that public health authorities then bled into values. For example, if these are the facts about COVID, then what should be the policy responses? And unfortunately, we have other processes like democracy and voting to kind of elucidate and have collective choice over those values. So I'm a big believer in scientific expertise. I think the decline in scientific expertise is a crisis in our society. The problem, though, is that some people are experts on facts. Nobody is an expert in values. And when the people that are experts in fact start claiming expertise in values, we have a severe problem. And that is something we have to stop. That whether, I don't know what the right answer is. Maybe it's the case that schools should have been shut down. Maybe it's the case that schools shouldn't have been shut down. But that is not a scientific question. It is not following the science to shut down schools. It is following the values. And that's okay, but that's something that everybody has a stake in, whether you run the NIH or whether you're a janitor. You're equivalent in our society in how much your values matter. And then the final thing I'll say is kind of why is it, and this is to your point, like why is it that we see this kind of concern over free speech now, and why do we think that people who run elite institutions are so worried about misinformation and so pro-censorship? And a lot of people have offered theories. So one theory is that people are scared of the democratization of people's right to free speech through things like social media. That when we had editorial functions, then it created like a filter for it. So that's one hypothesis. But I'm going to offer like a different, more controversial hypothesis. And it's basically, this is a symptom of the rise of meritocracy. So when you had previous generations of elites who ran elite institutions, I think they knew that a lot of the reason they got in their positions was not because of meritocracy. So that actually created a lot of social responsibility and respect for people who were below them, right? That it's not like we have to worry about people sharing information and having free speech, because it's not like I'm better than these people.
30 seconds, please.
But now I would say the last thing is that the people who run these elite institutions, they think they got where they were because not only are they intellectually superior, but they're morally superior. So to get into an elite college, you not only have to have a good SAT score, you have to have an essay that shows you're morally good. So when you get into these colleges, you're basically told, not are you intellectually better than people, you're morally better. And this, I think, results in a lot of the conflation between facts and values and the declining trust that we heard about earlier.
Thank you. Michael.
So I'm Michael McConnell. I'm wearing two hats on the platform here, maybe no hat at all, but I teach the free speech and press courses at Stanford and have at other law schools around the country, so that's one hat. But I'm also one of the co-chairs of Meta's outside oversight review board. That means I don't work for Meta, for Facebook, but the board has been entrusted with reviewing some of their most important and controversial decisions, including takedown decisions having to do with COVID. I'm not wearing a hat as a public health expert. I'm not, and I'm an interested American like anyone else, but have no expertise in who's right or wrong in any of these particular battles. I wanted to make four points. First is that we have a certain number of institutions in our society that I call First Amendment institutions, and they have been given the role, they have assumed the role, mostly non-governmental, of being of providing the media, the infrastructure through which a civil discourse takes place. Two of them of particular interest to this conversation are universities, whose they provide the infrastructure for scientific and academic dispute, scholarly dispute, and social media companies, which have which are the dominant platform today for most people to communicate. Some of them experts, some of them not. And I want to say, first of all, I think these institutions failed us during COVID. It's easier to say that with hindsight, but I think we can certainly see that. And I think of Dr. Bhattacharya and Dr. Atlas here as being prime examples of how Stanford failed in defending the right of legitimate researchers to take a dissenting view on important questions of public policy. And let me just add, I'm not pointing fingers at other people only. I want to point a finger at myself. Not that I had anything, any authority over the discussion of their information, but I didn't speak up. I would quietly express my view that what was being done to these esteemed colleagues was unfair and even outrageous, but did I try to organize resistance within Stanford? Did I go to the faculty senate and condemn the fact that they were censuring Scott Atlas? I did not. And why not? Partly because I keep in my own lane, but partly because I'm intimidated like anybody else, and especially because of my ignorance about public health and epidemiology and all this. How did I know, whether Jay's study, Santa Clara study, for example, was properly conducted? I didn't know. I think we now know so much more than we did then, but I regret having not been more outspoken on what my lane really is. And what I do know is that when First Amendment institutions suppress civil discourse, they are not doing their proper job. And regardless of who is right, even if Jay and Scott were wrong, and I think they're increasing evidence is that they were right, but even if they were wrong, they were contributing to a proper discussion of public policy, and they should not have been silenced. Now, there's a third First Amendment institution I'm going to turn to last, and that is my own, that is the Facebook Oversight Board, and I want to talk about that a bit at the end. Second point is that government efforts to coerce First Amendment organizations to censor other people are unconstitutional. Not only wrong, but illegal. Now, the Supreme Court had a very important case this year called Murthy, and this was a sprawling challenge to the efforts of especially the Biden administration to induce social media companies to censor people, including Jay and Scott. And the court reversed a decision in favor of the plaintiffs in this case, and it was widely misunderstood. Sorry?
30 seconds.
30 seconds, oh my goodness. It was widely misunderstood.
We'll have more time.
Saying that what the administration did was just fine. Court did not hold that. What it held is that the specific claims of the specific plaintiffs did not show that they personally were harmed. The Supreme Court did not hold that the federal government has a right to coerce social media companies into censoring. And I just lost my last 2 points.
There'll be more time.
Well, it's a good place for me to pick up because I actually represent Jay and Martin in that case, so I'm very familiar with it. Michael is absolutely right that there's been a lot of misrepresentations in the media about the case. The court did not find that what the government did was fine. It was about the specific plaintiffs and their ability to prove that the government caused the censorship in their case. Also, a little known fact is that it was actually up on an emergency motion from a preliminary injunction, which is a different standard than the lawsuit. So the lawsuit is still continuing in the district court, and actually we just filed a brief in that case. So that's the state of the case at this point. More generally speaking, the First Amendment protects what's called misinformation, despite the beliefs of many of the politicians in our country today. And there are several reasons for that. The framers of the Constitution recognize that nobody has a monopoly on the truth, and least of all, often government, who can be motivated by power, the desire to pursue political aims rather than pursuit of the truth. And government can easily label politically inconvenient ideas or facts misinformation and censor accordingly. That's the wisdom of the First Amendment, and it recognizes that discussion and debate rather than censorship are the best ways to gain knowledge. And we saw this during the COVID era. Early on, politicians, media, and academics decided there was no valid discussion to be had. Lockdowns and mandates were the right approach. Anyone who dared to suggest otherwise, as Scott knows and Alex knows, were told to shut up. They were endangering others, and cancel culture quickly turned to censorship. First, on the part of the social media companies, I forgot who said something about this, but actually there was some government involvement under the Trump administration, but it wasn't at the behest of Trump. It appeared that the CDC and an organization called the agency called the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency were doing this on their own. But in any event, the social media censorship quickly turned to government censorship, and the government saw that they could use the social media companies in order to censor ideas that government didn't like. And a lot of this was about the vaccines, but there was also some about lockdowns and masks. And one of the reasons I believe that they were censoring people was because the Biden administration had decided they wanted everybody to get vaccinated, and what they called vaccine misinformation interfered with their political aims. So high-up people in government, including the president himself, Surgeon General Vivek Murthy, Press Secretary Jennifer Psaki, openly bragged that they were working with social media companies to censor speech. And at the same time, that was accompanied by open threats to punish the companies if they didn't do what the government wants. And through the lawsuit, in which I represent Drs. Kuhldorff and Bhattacharya, we learned that the government censorship scheme was far more reaching than we ever could have imagined. There were dozens of agencies and at least 100 government actors involved who coerced, pressured, induced, and encouraged social media companies to censor First Amendment protected speech. One example that I think is important is Dr. Kuhldorff had a tweet where he said that naturally immune people and children don't need the vaccine, and it was labeled as misinformation because it contradicted the CDC's position on the matter. Dr. Kuhldorff is one of the top epidemiologists in the world, one of the most cited vaccine specialists, and this tweet was actually tagged by the Virality Project, which worked very, very closely. It was supposedly a non-governmental organization, but it worked so closely with the government it could effectively be called an arm of the government, and 2 courts actually have found that it was. So the idea that Dr. Kuhldorff, one of the most qualified people to opine on this subject, was censored at the behest of the Virality Project, which would be considered government, shows why the censorship is so dangerous. In the end, the effects of the censorship regime have been manifesting for some time. For instance, children have experienced catastrophic developmental setbacks because there was no real discussion about lockdowns. Deaths from alcoholism and substance abuse are at record highs because people suffered so much depression during the lockdowns. Young people who didn't need a experienced dangerous side effects, which public health officials have finally and quietly acknowledged are real. I actually have a client in another case whose 16-year-old son died a few days after getting the vaccine, and it was an autopsy revealed it was very likely caused by myocarditis effects. And that's not to say nobody should get the vaccine, but the point is that there should have been discussion on these topics, and that discussion was shut down. It was shut down by the social media companies and, worst of all, by the government.
About 30 seconds, please.
Okay. So I'll conclude by reemphasizing that what the government did was unequivocally unlawful. The Supreme Court is clear that the government can't use private companies to accomplish unconstitutional aims. But not only was it unlawful, it cost lives, and this episode shows really why we have a First Amendment.
Thank you. Okay, we'll proceed. I'll ask a few questions, but before I do that, I'd like to ask each of you, after hearing your colleagues, do you have anything to add or comment on? Go ahead, Alex.
Scott, you
Go ahead.
Gardiner, how do you believe that the left supports free speech? Kamala Harris and Tim Walz don't support.
Actually, I have a question about that.
Wait.
So we can.
Here's what I want to say is that welcome to my world. I mean, I battled with the West Wing of the White House every single day.
Why does that make it okay? Your
they
arguments.
complain every single day. They yelled at my editors. We're now the lawsuit about people essentially yelling at Alex's editors, which is the reason why the government, there's 100 actors across the government,
Twitter was
is because there's this giant infrastructure to go after reporters every single day.
I don't understand your argument.
Obviously,
I'm like, come on in. The water's fine. Why haven't you been here before?
Because I was a public defender.
Can we? I have a specific question on this.
Okay.
So, but thank you.
Bring it.
And Scott, you had something. Did you have something to add?
I mean,
Well,
Scott,
I have
by the way,
an observation.
can we just say, reporters are not the enemy of the people? Can we all agree on that, by the way?
I have a comment that I would like to make, and I'm not sure how relevant it is, but there's a legacy here of how the pandemic was managed. It's beyond the death and destruction. It's beyond the unethical shift of the burden to the poor people, to children. It's beyond even the loss of trust in institutions. It is a hateful division in America. That is the legacy of the lockdowners, of the people who are in power, of the politicized hate that is destroying our country. This is not political. It's not supposed to be a political discussion up here or anywhere else. If you look at COVID,
Yes. Second, I think.
yeah, if you look at COVID deaths per day, and a graph I always show, for the first 2 years, from March 2020 through April 2022, including since the vaccine was injected December 16, 2020, the slope of the line doesn't change in the United States. Now, for those who don't understand math, there's no change in the rate of COVID deaths per day. It's not political. It's two administrations. Yet somehow everything devolves into this political finger-pointing, which, you know, I'm really appalled at, I'm disgusted with, and I don't know how we're going to get past that as a country.
Well, and I think that's a question that we should continue to address. How can we get past this divide? How can we heal what is clearly such an emotionally sensitive topic? Others want to add to their comments? Or yes, please.
So,
Michael.
Let me just mention the recommendations that the Meta Oversight Board made in a retrospective look at the mistakes and successes of the COVID period. Two recommendations that I think they're modest. Maybe should have done more, but two modest recommendations. One is that social media companies inform the public when the government has asked them to take down speech. Now, some of those may be entirely legitimate, but it is our thought that putting this out before the public would itself, without any further legal action, have an enormously positive effect on this very difficult to regulate relationship between government and social media. Just let it be known. And so that's one recommendation. The second recommendation had to do with the specific COVID takedown policies of Meta. There were 80 statements, they call them claims, that were regarded as misinformation and dangerous and were taken down. The Oversight Board realized, though, that those 80 mostly arose at a time when we knew very little about what was going on. And so what we said is that the company should regularly re-examine each of those 80. It shouldn't just keep plowing ahead on the basis of past information. And this, too, should be done in the bright light of day. They should tell the public what the claims are and what the evidence is and invite further information. And I want to say this is not an attack on science. This is an attack on government policy, which is related to science but is not actually science. And if we actually could have a full knowledge and a public discussion of what is being taken down on social media, that would be a help.
Thank you. Quickly, Scott,
Well,
comment?
you can't, it's the opposite of transparency to take down information. I mean, that is just antithetical to everything that the country stands for. It's a free country. I don't think it's appropriate at all for a certain group of people to get together and say, okay, let's see, this one's real dangerous, let's take that one
Let's
down.
keep coming back to
the
that.
solution to misinformation is more information. That's statement number one.
Shining.
And statement number two is that the biggest purveyors of misinformation were the government, the CDC, and all those people who demand that other information is taken down.
Thank you, Scott. Neil, do you have anything to add?
Okay.
You're okay. Okay, well, let me slightly, actually, I don't even think it is changing the topic, but I want to embellish a little bit on this and get people to tell me where their line is. But basically, as a country throughout history, we've permitted or at least tolerated censorship during times of war. And we could say the pandemic is essentially like a time of war. In fact, during World War II, the government had an office of censorship, okay? And more recently, the NSA was empowered to actually listen to individuals' conversations, especially in their communications internationally after, of course, 9/11.
Another great
please let me
censorship,
finish.
by the way. My colleagues were not allowed to do that story for a year and a half.
And of course, we know through what the discussion is today that Mark Zuckerberg, Meta, admitted to Congress that they regretted having allowed the federal government to pressure the company into moderating certain kinds of online speech. So my question is, the U.S. government has a history of censorship and curtailment of First Amendment rights in the name of protecting lives, okay? If the government believes that false information about a pandemic is being disseminated, and that false information threatens lives, is there ever a point at which they should censor or coerce and limit the information that they believe is dangerous to people? So my question is there ever a point? Is there a line there at all?
No.
So basically the answer to that question is no, but let me go back. It wasn't a time of war. The reason that you can arguably censor in a time of war is because there's an enemy, okay? An enemy that is going to listen to your plans and possibly react. The virus was going to do what the virus was going to do. It's a terrible analogy. The reason that the government wanted censorship was to influence American public opinion and push vaccines. And by the way, although what happened to me was terrible and a violation of my civil liberties, it's infinitesimal compared to what happened when the government forced mandates, okay? So that was the violation of civil liberties.
Others, where their line is? Thank you.
Well, there's never a case where you should trust someone else to determine truth. Haven't we learned that in this pandemic? I can't believe I'm even listening to somebody who might say, yeah, we should be censoring. Why would you vote to be censored? I don't understand the whole logic of this. We're a free country. People don't understand the difference between, by the way, Sweden and the United States. What Sweden did was they trusted the people. It's a free society. They made recommendations. They didn't make mandates. Here, we decided we're not going to trust the people. We're going to tell the people what to do. We're going to force it. That's an example of this so-called censorship.
So there's
I'm
never a point.
If I'm going to err, I'm going to err on the side of free speech.
I covered the CDC for nearly 20 years. When I first went down to the CDC in the 1990s, same thing with the NIH, I used to just fly to Atlanta and I could wander around the CDC, knock on doors, talk to anybody I wanted to. Now, and this has happened across the federal government, basically, the White House has shut down absolutely everything. So what happened to the pandemic, which was so disastrous, is that there's actually a huge plethora of opinions within the CDC. Same thing at the NIH. All of those organizations were basically, all of those voices were silenced. And what happened was just a few people within the administrations, in both the Trump administration and the Biden administration, were sort of allowed to give essentially what was the party line about the science. So the reporters, the science reporters like me, who used to be able to talk to 20 different scientists within CDC, many of whom had very different ideas about how to things, were only allowed to talk to Rochelle Walensky. She became the sole spokesperson for the CDC.
So is there ever a line?
This was a disaster, in my opinion.
Your opinion is there's never a point that the government should censor or coerce?
No, I think the government did a poor job, I think we can all agree, of talking about uncertainty, talking about what they didn't
Slightly different
know.
question, but...
And if they had allowed reporters to talk to a whole bunch of their staff, as we were allowed to do 20 years ago, we would have been able to give that sense of uncertainty and doubt.
Fair enough. Neil?
Yeah, I mean, I would say the history of this country is that during times of crisis, civil liberties, in retrospect, are always violated more than they should have been. So you give World War II as the example. They said, to protect this country in World War II, we will imprison Japanese Americans. In the Vietnam War and the Iraq War after 9/11, they said, in order to protect this country, we are going to restrict people's speech. We are going to restrict the freedom of the press. So I would say the big problem is that we have always erred way more on the side of restricting civil liberties. And I will just say something pessimistic about this conference. I don't mean to offend anybody, but I think if the next pandemic happens a year or two from now, people are well prepared to resist and protect their civil liberties. People have very short memories. If the next pandemic happens 25 to 30 years from now, the same stuff is going to happen. I pessimistically predict it because always in times of crisis, people's fear restrict liberties. And that's why you always have to err on the side of civil liberties.
Thank you. Michael?
This discussion is highly unrealistic. The United States has the most vibrant free speech law and culture of anywhere in the world. Talk to anyone elsewhere, and they think the United States is a little crazy because of how seriously we protect free speech. But that doesn't mean that you can say anything. It has never meant that. You cannot threaten people with violence. You cannot use words to intimidate them. You cannot defame them. You cannot incite violence. The basic idea is that we only restrict speech. This is in theory. I don't mean to deny that there are all kinds of violations that take place in practice. But the theory is that the government can't restrict speech unless there is solid proof of an imminent danger to other human beings. Now, I don't know quite, we've never had this applied to a pandemic before, but there may be some implications there. There may be some things that are said, like advocacy by people pretending to be experts of drinking bleach or whatever it happens to be. But a more important point here is that we shouldn't conflate the government, which should be very restrained on this, with private First Amendment institutions like universities and social media. Stanford and other universities do not have to let people stand in a classroom and spout nonsense, right? And social media companies do not have to allow their platforms to be used for demonstrably dangerous material. Now, they have a First Amendment right to decide what is going to go on over their own
Good point of the distinction between private and government. Janine.
The government absolutely should not be able to coerce or pressure private companies to censor speech during an emergency, and I would say especially during an emergency. That's when we need to hear the full panoply of opinions. And as for the analogy that Michael just drew to incitement, that's a very narrow exception for very sort of direct incitement where I think people don't have the opportunity to reflect. You're not reading something online and you can Google or you can think about it or you can talk to your wife. This is like you're getting people to act on their emotions. Go kill that guy right there. He did something bad. And so I don't think that exception can apply to something like a public health emergency.
So let me turn the conversation just to turn a little bit, because I think we're, as a panel, pretty clear that the United States is a culture and democracy where we prize obvious free speech liberties, and we don't feel the government should censor. There's a slightly nuanced version or question of this, and it came up during the Murphy versus Missouri case, which has been mentioned, and of course, many are familiar with, of course, Jay for sure. And besides this subtle technical issue of lack of standing, in the oral arguments, Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson was most vocal on the topic of whether the government can coerce. And said there are times, she said, quote, "There are times in which the government can, depending on the circumstances, encourage, perhaps even coerce platforms to suppress protected speech." So my direct question is, but censorship is clear. We're saying, no, they can't. Coercion is something different. And let me boil it down to a specific question. Does the government have a First Amendment right themselves for freedom of speech to coerce?
No. The Supreme Court just said in Vula that they don't. They recognize that the government actors do not have First Amendment rights in their capacity as government actors. Sure, they can go home and say whatever they want, but when they're using the authority of the weight of their office, they can't. And that was just reaffirmed in a case that was heard on the same day as Murphy called NRA versus Vulo. They said that government actors' free speech rights and where other people's rights begin, they cannot use their power in order to censor other people.
So the so-called jawboning that was in essence, part of what was brought up in this case. The government cannot jawbone to what they want. Michael.
No, that's simply false. There's a
Which is false?
The statement about jawboning. So the government cannot coerce And I think Justice Jackson was not quite right when in the quote that you said, that the government does have the right to try to persuade, but they do not have the right, I don't think ever, to coerce social media or other First Amendment institutions to coerce them to censor protected speech. They do, however, have the right to jawbone.
So
They
Michael,
can jawbone all they want.
So they have a right, they have a protected First Amendment right, is your point. Let's work our way down. Neil?
I have a question for you, Michael.
If we could-
Facebook's business depends on Section 230. Can't exist without Section 230. If I jawbone the government, if I, as a White House official, jawbone Facebook, and a few days later, a White House official says Section 230 is under review, is that inherently coercive, or am I just speaking?
So, Alex, I think you're asking an unanswerable question. The line, whenever somebody with authority over another person tells them, advises them, tries to persuade them, it's never going to be clear whether that's just persuasion or whether that's coercion.
So is it it's a fact-dependent question?
And so in order for the courts to intervene and tell government officials that they cannot persuade, they need some concrete evidence that it's being coercive. Now, I think in Murthy there was such evidence, and the Supreme Court did not say otherwise. What the Supreme Court said is the particular plaintiffs in the case did not present the evidence of that. But the Volo case was unanimous in the same year, where you had concrete evidence that officials in New York threatened banks and insurance companies that if they didn't stop doing business with the National Rifle Association, that they would have audits and so forth. And the court said unanimously that that was unconstitutional.
But Michael, there's the law of state action says that the government can't use private entities to do what it can't do directly. And if the government can't abridge the freedom of speech, then even if it's using its powers of persuasion, I think that's a First Amendment violation.
Persuasion and coercion are difficult to distinguish, but they are entirely different for purposes of the law. The government can try to persuade. It can run ads saying, join the Marines. It doesn't have to run ads saying, don't join the Marines.
But you don't have a constitutional right to join the Marines or not join the Marines. You have a constitutional right to free speech. So if the government is using its authority in order to...
You do have a constitutional right to join or not join the Marines.
Okay.
So let me, let's keep this...
okay, that's not what I...
I want to, in the sake of time, keep this going, and I appreciate that. I think we've kind of outlined this. One quick comment.
My quick question, really, to the lawyers here is, isn't the First Amendment designed to limit government intrusion? It's for the people, the First Amendment. These are freedoms for the people, not for the government.
Yes.
Am I wrong or am I right?
Yes.
So the word intrusion is designed to obscure the difference between persuasion and coercion. The Constitution protects against the use of governmental power to coerce people. It does not protect against the government being able to persuade people.
Thank you. So I want to, for the sake of time, touch on a very different topic, I think, still broadly within censorship and free speech. The FDA approves drugs as safe and effective for particular uses. As part of that process, the agency approves labeling. That directs the use of the drug. However, the FDA, as a practical matter, and it's in their policy, they bar speech by a drug manufacturer to promote or in any way talk about off-label uses, that is, anything that is not in the label. This is a clear restriction of the speech of a pharmaceutical manufacturer, in that many of the pieces of information a pharmaceutical manufacturer may speak about are published facts. They're large randomized trials. Clearly, the doctors and the patients would be better for either the use or implementation of that drug or therapeutic. On the other hand, During the pandemic, the FDA took a very different approach. Li Fang recently reported on a Real Clear investigation review of ads that ran tens of thousands of times during the pandemic that found that major vaccine companies routinely exploited a regulatory loophole to skirt marketing rules on full disclosure while embarking on massive paid media campaigns to sell the COVID vaccines. I'm quoting from his article. By casting their spots as public service announcements, promoting the idea that people should get vaccines rather than a company's specific product, drug companies claimed that the disclosure requirements did not apply, and FDA allowed the lack of full disclosure to happen. As a result, the required disclosures, the required disclosure about the vaccines operating under emergency approval and the required disclosures of full vaccine safety rarely appeared in the ads. So my question is, this discrepancy shows that FDA may apply free speech regulation at a whim and inconsistently. And that's clear from these two examples. So my question is, do pharmaceutical manufacturers have First Amendment rights to discuss whatever they want, as long as it is truthful? Or does the government have the right to control the speech of pharmaceutical companies at their own whim? So anybody want to pick up this one?
I'm happy to. I covered the FDA for some 20 years. The FDA does not police effectively in almost any way drug makers' speech. There's one person in that office that oversees thousands upon thousands of ads effectively, as the Office of the Inspector General at HHS has written about multiple times. Drug makers will run an ad that is often violating FDA rules and is not actually truthful. The FDA will take somewhere between 6 months and 18 months to send a warning letter to the drug maker. By then, the ad has run its course. The drug makers, this has happened in the case of EPO, it's happened countless times. And so, you know.
So your point is, a practical matter, it doesn't happen a lot, but they do have they clearly approve the speech of pharmaceutical companies.
They have the authority that they do not.
So should they or should they not?
Well, I mean, I would say, like, okay, so there's this legal question, but I want to kind of pivot back to the ethical question underlying this. So one is that if you talk to most people around the world, they would say that it's insane that the US allows direct-to-consumer advertising for pharmaceutical companies. So that's a restriction in most places in the world, right? So I think tying back to like our previous discussion, this is a very US-centric conversation. Most other liberal democracies restrict speech much more than the United States. But it's not like we don't call those places liberal democracies. So part of the discussion of our next generation is like, what kind of liberal democracy do we want to live in? There's some in Europe that don't respect free speech, and that's because they have a history of genocide and violence that we don't have in the United States. And that's a decision we have to make. But I think the second ethical point is that, do we have equal treatment under the law, or is there hypocrisy? So I think what upset people at the FDA case are some pharmaceutical countries or some therapeutics like COVID vaccines treated differently than others. And this also came up when the CD said, well, if you're going to protest the lockdowns, you're going to be in trouble. But if you're going to protest police brutality, well, then you can go out and protest. So I think that's what upsets people, is the hypocrisy that different people are treated different ways. That's the real ethical consideration.
And that's the essence.
Well,
where in that spectrum, so should they allow free speech of pharmaceutical manufacturers to promote whatever they want? Or should they restrict, even if they might not do it?
That's an ethical question, a legal question people are going to disagree about. But I think the underlying thing is that it seemed highly problematic that because of public policy objectives to vaccinate as many people from COVID, certain principles were relaxed for certain groups of people, which I think that's a problem.
But this comes up in Alex's complaint, which is, do corporations have fundamental First Amendment free speech rights that are unabridgeable, right? That's your basic question, because FDA rules clearly seem to abridge the free speech right.
And they're applied at a whim.
And they are applied whimsically. But what Alex has included in his complaint, the chief executive and chairman of Pfizer, and Scott Gottlieb, a board member, And because they spent time jawboning Twitter to try to get Twitter to take Alex off of. Now, I have a book coming out in 6 months about Johnson & Johnson. It's going to be very tough on them. They are going to complain about me, I'm sure. And what I want to hear from you, did Pfizer have this First Amendment right?
Yeah, they're not defendants on the First Amendment count.
Alex, your point is that they have the First Amendment right to talk. Yes.
They're defendants on the 2 other counts.
Okay.
Well,
Scott, do you have a Scott?
I would like
to
to
know
hear
what the
what
law
Michael
is on
McConnell
this. So the law, it isn't whether they're corporations or not. The question is whether it's commercial speech or not. And commercial speech is speech by anyone. Could be an individual, could be a corporation, which is attempting to sell, basically to sell a product. And whether you like it or not, for more than 100 years, the Supreme Court has says that actually, they used to say there was no protection for commercial speech at all, but in more recent decades, they have held that the right of anyone to try to sell a product to another person is subject to a lesser degree, and that the government can regulate this in the interest of preventing, fraud and consumer abuse and so forth, that they can do that on less than the usual standard. And the big issue for the FDA, in addition to all the arbitrariness and so forth, which is just typical of every government agency, the issue is, does the FDA have to prove that what the speech is actually harmful, that the drug is harmful, or is it sufficient for them simply to show that the claims of the company are not proven? So who has the burden of proof? Does the government have to prove it's harmful, or does the pharmaceutical company have to be able to substantiate their claims? That's the legal argument. And I'm not sure how the courts will eventually come out on that.
Thank you. Scott, you quick.
No, I was deferring to the constitutional law expert on the First Amendment.
All right, well, we barely scratched the surface of my questions, but I'll put those aside and get to the audience. Thank you. So for Professor McConnell, if social media companies exercise extensive editorial control, can it really be claimed that they are platforms rather than publishers?
So this is a question of use of the English language, right? Are they still platforms? What is a platform? I mean, we now platform is a word we all use, and it basically takes its meaning from the practice of the social media companies. They are platforms if we say so. Now, the underlying legal question is whether Section 230, which Alex referred to, of the Communications Decency Act, that is the key statute that the social media rights are hinged upon. And that does give social media companies a kind of double benefit that no other First Amendment organization has. They both have the right to decide what to leave up or take down from their platforms, and they are insulated from criminal or civil prosecution, suits and so forth, for the content of what goes over the platform. That may or may not be a just arrangement. I don't know. It has been the law for quite some time. And I can tell you that if it weren't there, the social media companies would be forced to censor a whole lot more speech than they censor now.
Thank you. Alex, it looked like you have a quick comment on that.
I mean, I think there's a really good dissent in a case in the Ninth Circuit that was just decided by actually a Trump appointee, where he goes into the history of the Communications Decency Act and Section 230, and makes the point that we really do not know at this point what to do with these companies, that they are their own publishers, they are distributors of speech, they are common carriers because they reach such a big audience. As a practical matter, it's impossible to ask them to look at all the content or hold them liable for all the content they carry, and yet we have given them at the same time, this incredible power, this immunity. And the older I get, the more I understand that giving anybody absolute immunity for anything is a giant mistake. But you know, whether it's vaccines or social media companies. But so I mean, we really, in some ways, like, we need to figure this out and then figure out what the law should be. Instead, the Ninth Circuit has just made a series of decisions over the last 20 years that are arguable in the law, but have had the result of creating the situation that you know, Professor McConnell points out. And it's also made the companies incredibly dependent on 230 because they built their operations around this. So any threat to that is something they have to take as an existential threat. So it's a bad position that we've put ourselves in, and how we get ourselves out, I don't know.
I'm
Thank you.
completely with
Let me,
Alex on that. And I think it's unfair that the New York Times has none of the protections and the traditional media that the social media platforms have. Like, and they cannot
Some
call
reform there is needed. I think we probably, or at least further discussion on it. There's a question for Dr. Atlas. What is the appropriate way for many to respond to your colleagues organizing public statements of oppositions to your view? So what would be the appropriate response to those that are organizing opposition to your view?
Now, you know, I'll answer it this way. I have no problem with people saying whatever they want unless it violates the existing laws that were outlined, like defamation, inciting violence. I'm not the only one in here who's had a lot of death threats, had to hire 24/7 police security in my driveway, even though I live in Stanford, 94305. So, I mean, that says something. I'm fine with people criticizing. I don't care what, you know, I think you might be able to tell I don't care what people think of me because right is right. People are dying. I had to say the truth. And I think one of the things that comes with becoming a public figure, reluctantly or not, is, and many of us in this room can understand this statement, there's a burden of responsibility. You're speaking for millions of people. They depend on you to say it. I got thousands of emails every day, including hundreds of doctors and scientists in this country begging me to keep speaking, including from inside Stanford, inside infectious disease at Stanford, inside the NIH.
Silently
Please keep
supporting.
speaking. We are afraid for our families and our jobs, quote unquote. So I don't really care what people organizing. That's fine. I mean, I don't want to go off on it. It's ludicrous. It's embarrassing for the university. It's embarrassing for people who think that the faculty senate is such an important institution. That's what they're doing. Okay, fine. Whatever. I mean, we have people depending on hearing the truth. We're an ethical society. The truth matters. My children matter to me. I don't want them to inherit a country that is just ignoring fact, and we just have to persevere.
Thank you. Let me pick up on your point about Stanford here in a question that is directed towards Neil, but I'd like to hear everybody's point. Why was it so difficult for universities, including Stanford, to impanel discussions like this during the pandemic? And why were traditional university commitments to academic freedom so hard to keep during the pandemic? Picking up a little bit about.
Yes, I'll briefly respond to that. I mean, people forget what the environment was like in 2020, 2021. I mean, people didn't have really personal interactions. A lot of these important institutional decisions, including the censure of Dr. Atlas, occurred on Zoom votes and things like that. I would say there's a lot of hurting that goes on in times of crisis, that once the hurting starts, you look really bad if you're kind of going against it. And there's a concept called isomorphism in sociology, which is essentially you would think in capitalistic or free societies with inquiry, you would get a lot of diversity of opinion and practice, but actually you get a lot of homogeneity. So that's, I think, what happened. I think is what the sociologist would predict happens.
Yes, Michael, please.
I'd just like to put a word in for leadership here. It does matter who's at the top, and it was so gratifying to see our new president opening this conference. That would not have happened, I suspect.
I think a round of applause for that. Okay, thank you. This is directed for Janine, but I think we probably will hear from everybody. What is your definition of misinformation?
Well, I was using the term kind of ironically, I suppose. I mean, I don't think there is a definition of misinformation. It just means something, I guess, that's not true. So it's not really a new concept, even though, you know, there's sort of a perception that maybe misinformation and disinformation are new ideas that have to do with social media or use of social media. But yeah, I mean, I don't know if there is a definition. It's just people say it is.
Yeah, my opinion is that the word misinformation is a weaponization used to demonize and delegitimize and make people afraid about hearing information. I think it's just, it may be the second biggest contribution of our younger generation. The first one was the selfie. And, you know, I just think misinformation is really a very dangerous word because it is used to censor. We cannot have a free society. The most fundamental freedom of all, and the legal people can correct me if I'm wrong, that is the basis for every other freedom is freedom of speech.
Okay, excellent. Any distinction between malinformation or
well, the researchers call misinformation, disinformation different things. So disinformation is when you're purposely doing it, whereas misinformation can include people inadvertently or just in their best intentions. And that's why a lot of the social media companies actually focus a lot on disinformation because it's coordinated by things like foreign entities and things like that. I mean, I think the big problem here is that a lot of this is just the fundamental age-old philosophical question of what truth is. And for most people, their truth is mediated. Right? So there's some information that I can assess on my own. Like I can go out and know the temperature because I can buy a thermometer and get it. But there's most other information I have to trust people. So when people tell me that Biden won the 2020 election, I cannot go and validate those votes. Like I trust it that it's mediated information. And I think the most dangerous thing that happened after COVID is that we rely on mediated information, and now we have whole subpopulations of the country that don't believe in mediated information. It's very scary.
I was at the New York Times when Donald Trump came into the White House, and we had constant meetings about how to characterize his obvious misstatements about crowd sizes, about other things. Do we call them misspeaking, mistaken? We eventually got to lies, as we are going to characterize these as lies because while we couldn't get into his head, we knew he must know these are false claims. The present claims about Haitian immigrants in Springfield, Ohio, eating cats and dogs are obvious lies. And so the question that has bedeviled the New York Times and other mediated organizations is, what do we do about this? Because it turns out what we discovered is that the Trump administration had decided that by saying lies, they ended up making these claims more viral because in correcting them, we repeated the lies. So we got caught in
lies,
this dynamic.
a pretty old word, right? It's only
Yeah.
3 letters, so it's got to be a very old word. And misinformation is a new word, but they're not distinguishable from one another is what I guess I'm hearing.
No, I think he was just explaining that disinformation is lies.
Yes, disinformation.
And misinformation is potentially just incorrect information that's not necessarily deliberate.
That was sort of the point I was trying to make, is that they're new words used to describe actually age-old concepts, and I think it gives the impression that, okay, it's okay for the government to censor this because this is something different, something we haven't seen
And
before.
that's, I think, Scott's point. All right, I'd like to come to a point where I give you a couple more minutes each to wrap up and give your thoughts, but there's one last one I would like to touch on. It's for Gardiner. And it's if we have such terrible infrastructure against truth set up in the government, which you are, I think, very vocal and emotional about, how do we begin dismantling it?
Say the question again.
Okay, if we have such a terrible infrastructure against truth set up in government, how do we begin dismantling it?
Okay, I'm still not sure I understand that question, but how do we begin to dismantle the infrastructure within government to that?
Here's my question. I was asking, like, if you're saying there's this big infrastructure that's set up to actually go after people.
Oh, I see.
Trying to get at truth.
Right.
If that infrastructure set up in government to kind of go after people, like reporters,
Right.
how do we begin dismantling?
It's a good, okay, I get it now. You know, it's a really good question. This is not Republican administrations, this is Democrat, like the secular trend in government has been this concentration of power around messaging, and the White House now, you know, the FDA used to be an independent scientific agency that was, you know, never had anything to do with the White House. That is gone. The same thing with the NIH and CDC. There used to be all these, what were seen as independent agencies, and they could do their own messaging without any reference to the White House or the larger political objectives. That's simply, Republican and Democratic administrations have all gone toward controlling the messaging in a huge way. And as a result, you have this homogenized message that I think certainly during the COVID pandemic, people really pushed back on.
Thank you.
I don't know how to fix it. It's all
Big
gone
problem.
in one way, and it's almost unfixable.
A lot of tentacles to cut off.
Yeah.
Okay, I'd like to pass it down the line here. Scott, down a minute or so for
okay.
closing.
Thank you. First, I want to thank John Levin for having a spine to put the meeting on against a lot of pushback. I want to finish with just listing actions that I believe are important as steps toward restoring trust, because I think we know we can't have a free society, a diverse society, if we don't trust institutions that are important as well as each other. And in terms of the COVID management, these are my suggestions. First, we need a clear definition of what a public health emergency is. That's the gateway to all the rights violations and everything else that was done, and yet that's a very ambiguous concept with no time limits, and it should require legislation to extend. After all, we are a representative government. We need to add term limits to the health agency positions. I'm not talking about the politicians. This is a different level. This is the mid and top level
positions.
Agency positions after first cleaning house of all the heads of the CDC, the NIH, and the FDA. We need to forbid drug royalty sharing by employees of the NIH, the FDA, and the CDC. $325 million of royalties were shared with those people over the 10 years prior to the pandemic. We need to require immediate posting of all FDA, CDC, and NIH meetings. These people work for us. What are they saying? We should know real time. We need to reset by somehow that the CDC and other health agencies are advisory. They recommend, they give information. They don't set laws. They don't have power to set mandates. And one smaller thing is, but important, we need to immediately halt, in my opinion, all binding agreements and pledges to the World Health Organization until we figure out what they're doing and their level of competence improves. And the final statement is, somebody asked, and I should have answered this better, what to do about these rebukes and all this. We have a country where there's a deficit in courage. Okay, we need to step up. We need good people, and most people are good people, to step up, not just for yourself, but when you step forward and you speak out, you're empowering your friends and neighbors who all agree with you. And I think we need to learn, without courage here, we're not going to be able to have a peaceful, prosperous, and successful country.
Thank you.
So let me be a little bit hopeful. I mean, the reason that I was censored was that I was reaching 200 million people. In August 2021, when Twitter banned me, I reached 200 million people, 200 million impressions that month. Okay, so that's a lot of impressions. The platforms are powerful bullhorns for dissent, for discussion. They should be encouraged to be those bullhorns. I know that's scary for elites. It's scary for people in elite institutions. Democrats, I think that's why Democrats are, more anti-free speech now than Republicans. Democrats have taken the high ground in most of the elite institutions, and to have yahoos like me shouting and reaching a lot of people they don't like. But ultimately, the platforms can be voices for free speech. Whether or not we want to regulate them and as common carriers and say they have to carry everything, that's a complicated question. But there's a simple question which we can answer simply, which is the government should not be targeting individual users. The federal government should not be targeting individual users or individual posts. If they're illegal, go get a warrant, arrest me or whatever, but don't secretly try to target me. And one last thing, the platforms, as part this would be an easy fix. They should not delete user history, okay? Whether it's Facebook or X. If they want to ban you under their rules, and we're going to allow them to do that, okay? But that is Orwellian and wrong.
Okay, thank you. Gardiner, 1 minute.
I want to disagree with almost everything Scott Atlas just said, because I think what he is wanting to do is just increase this White House centralized power over these scientific agencies. You can be unhappy with the CDC and the FDA during the pandemic. Lord knows they failed in multiple ways. But the trends that I was talking about are all about how these agencies have been brought to heel by the politicians and their information masters in the White House. And everything he just said was about bringing them even more to heel. In my opinion, there should be 1,000 points of light. They should be made even more independent. They can say what they want to say, and many voices within them can say what they want to say. But you want more of this? Follow his advice.
Thank you. Neil?
I think the big word of the day is trust. Trust is a two-way street. We need ordinary people to trust all kinds of information, science, other forms of mediated information like election results, and we need elites to trust the people more. Trust them to share information, engage with ideas. And I think kind of one step that scientists can take is to distinguish between facts and values, focus more on the facts. Don't try to impose your values on people as much as you like them. Trust in the democratic process. That's the only way we're going to save our liberal democracy.
Thank you. Michael?
Well, I think it would be helpful if people stayed in their own lanes more, that they actually stick to what they know about. And this is picking up on both what Neil said and one of Scott's suggestions, that it really bothered me during the COVID matter that I never knew whether the public policy decision was being made by the scientists or whether it was being made by the politicians.
Exactly.
And I think that it would be better if the scientists just told us the facts and then have a different person identifiably use that information to make a public policy. I was particularly disturbed. This is just one incident, one little incident, but Governor Cuomo in New York would shut down a whole bunch of churches and synagogues. And when, in the eve of the court hearing on this, he redrew the map in New York so as to get the churches that were litigating out, and yet, and this is totally political. I mean, had no science whatsoever, and yet when they get into court, what the judges were told is these are scientific decisions about levels of risk in New York, and you need to defer to the science.
So stay in your own lane. Good advice. Thank you, Janine.
I don't like that.
I'll just wrap up by correcting what I said earlier, so you don't all think I'm an idiot. Yes, you do have a right not to join the Marines. You probably don't have a right to join the Marines. The analogy I should have made was you don't have a right to not have ads on your TV urging you to join the Marines. And that's the point, is that you do have enumerated or explicit First Amendment right to speak free from government interference, and so the government should not be able to use its powers of persuasion or coercion or any other power in order to censor American speech. Thank you.
Thank you all very much. We're at lunchtime, and we'll reconvene this afternoon.